Today, we're diving into one of the most fascinating political and economic unions in modern history, the European Union. You know, it's kind of amazing that the EU even exists, considering that at one point in history, Europe was the most war-torn part of the world. For centuries, starting in the Middle Ages and stretching all the way to the 20th century, more wars were fought on this continent than anywhere else. Just think of the 30 Years' War, which claimed millions of lives, or the two world wars, both of which started in Europe. So how do countries that were once bitter enemies come together and form a union that's now compared to global powers like the US or China? Is the European Union truly the most civilized of them all? Stick around, because we're going to explore everything from the Union's origins to its role in shaping the future of global politics. And I promise, you'll be surprised by some of what we uncover. Ready? Let's get started. So, how did the European Union come to be? Well, it wasn't exactly an overnight process. In fact, the seeds of the EU were planted in the aftermath of World War II. Europe had just witnessed one of the most devastating conflicts in human history, and leaders were desperate to avoid another large-scale war. That's when the idea of uniting countries economically and politically started to gain traction. It all began with the European Coal and Steel Community in 1951. The logic was simple. By controlling coal and steel production, key resources for war countries would be less likely to fight each other. 6 countries signed on: France, West Germany, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. Fast forward to 1957, and we get the Treaty of Rome, which established the European Economic Community, EEC. This created a common market where goods, services, capital, and people could move freely. Over the years, more countries joined, and by 1993, the European Union, as we know it today, was officially formed under the Maastricht Treaty. But this was no longer just an economic club. It became a political union with shared laws and institutions like the European Parliament, the European Court of Justice, and the European Central Bank. Now, let's step back and ask, how does the European Union compare to other global heavyweights like the US or China? First, the EU is huge. It's the third largest economy in the world, right behind the US and China, with a GDP of about $18 trillion in 2023. But the EU isn't just an economic powerhouse, it's also a political and diplomatic one. Unlike countries like the US, where decisions are made centrally in Washington, the EU is a complex system of governance that balances national sovereignty with collective decision-making. In some ways, it's like trying to get 27 roommates to agree on how to split the rent. Not always easy, but when it works really well. However, if we look at military power, the EU doesn't exactly compare to the US or China. There's no EU army, though many of its member states are part of NATO. In terms of defense, the US and China are in a different league. But what the EU lacks in military might, it makes up for in soft power. And in most cases, this power is more effective than nuclear weapons. Through its policies, trade agreements, and humanitarian efforts, the EU wields significant influence in global diplomacy. It's known for promoting democratic values, human rights, and environmental sustainability, things that some argue make it a more civilized player on the world stage. One small but fascinating example of the EU's regulatory influence is how it recently compelled Apple to adopt the USB-C charging standard. For years, Apple resisted switching from its proprietary Lightning cord, but under EU pressure to reduce electronic waste, the iPhone 15 became the first model with USB-C. Future models will follow suit. This shows how the EU can impact even the biggest global tech companies. Let's take a look at some of the key initiatives from the EU that are making an impact in Europe and across the world. First, there's the EU's plan to stop the sale of gasoline and diesel cars by 2035. This initiative is all about reducing carbon emissions and making the shift to electric vehicles. Companies like Volkswagen and BMW are already ramping up their production of electric vehicles to meet these new environmental standards. Then there's the General Data Protection Regulation, introduced in 2018. This law changed the game for how personal data is handled, requiring companies to get clear consent from users before using their info. EU citizens now have more control over their data, and companies face huge fines if they don't comply. This law has impacted major global players like Google and Facebook, and it's even inspired other countries like Japan and Brazil to adopt similar regulations. The Schengen Zone is another major perk, allowing them to travel freely between member countries without border checks. This makes traveling around Europe super convenient. And let's not forget the Erasmus Plus program, which gives students the chance to study in other EU countries, promoting education and cultural exchange. Lastly, the euro, used by 19 countries in the EU, is the second most important currency in the world. On top of that, the EU is also the largest humanitarian donor globally, providing billions of euros to help countries hit by disasters and crises. So, let's talk about that. Is the European Union more civilized than other global powers? This is where things get really interesting. The EU often presents itself as a beacon of human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. For example, the European Convention on Human Rights and the European Court of Human Rights give individuals the ability to challenge their governments on human rights abuses. The EU also leads the way on environmental initiatives. It was one of the first regions to commit to carbon neutrality by 2050, and its Green Deal aims to make Europe the first climate-neutral continent. The EU is unique in how it balances personal freedoms with collective responsibility. While the US often emphasizes individual rights as a reflection of freedom, and China focuses on collective societal progress, the EU combines both approaches. It values personal liberty while also stressing the importance of working together for the common good, making it stand out not necessarily better, but certainly different. Of course, the EU is far from perfect, and it has some pretty big challenges ahead. One major issue is the rise of nationalism within member states. Brexit, which saw the UK leave the EU in 2020, was a huge blow. In some countries, people are increasingly skeptical about the EU, especially when it comes to issues of national independence and control. Then there's the economic divide between wealthier northern countries and the poorer southern and eastern ones. Balancing the interests of 27 diverse nations is no small feat, and with crises like inflation and migration, the EU's unity is often tested. But despite these hurdles, the EU remains a key player in global affairs. Its ability to adapt and reform has been its greatest strength. Whether it's pushing for stronger climate policies, standing up to authoritarian regimes, or negotiating major trade deals, the EU proves that it's still a force to be reckoned with. Its future might not be crystal clear, but its foundation of cooperation and shared values remains strong. So, there you have it, the European Union, a unique blend of nations working together for a common future. It's not perfect, but in many ways, it's one of the most ambitious projects in modern history. What do you think? What qualities, in your opinion, make the European Union so unique? And what does the future hold for this union? Will EU countries be able to remain united in the face of challenges like nationalism and migration crises? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your opinion. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into the world's most interesting topics. See you next time.